Welcome. I have actually a few titles for this presentation. One is it ever ethical for a therapist to be naked with a client? In relation to that, the subtitle will be On Context in Psychotherapy. Another potential title for this is 13 Ethical and Moral Junctions in Psychotherapy, Counseling, Social Work. And the last one of potential title is Beyond Clinical, Ethical, Legal, and Risk Management. So you choose perhaps which one kind of speak to you the most. I'm Ofer Zur, PhD, a licensed psychologist, ethicist, instructor, expert witness, author, and most importantly, a critical thinker. Thank you for joining us. In this presentation, I'm going to differentiate clinical, like theoretical orientation, ethical, code of ethics, legal, federal state law, licensing board regulations, and risk management, which is kind of protection of us therapists as well as saving for insurance. All this versus our own and our community sense of moral stances. So it would be kind of a right versus wrong 13 junctions that we are going to talk about. So we'll start with the standard of care, the definition, the quality of condition which prevail or should prevail in a particular mental health context that a prudent practitioner follows. What is belong under context is a patient, the diagnosis, the culture of the patient, the setting. Are you in private practice downtown New York? Are you an aircraft carrier in the military? Are you traveling with a team as a sports psychologist? So it depends. Therapist cultures, as mentioned before, patient culture, is it online or in person? Is it what kind of community are you practicing in the East Coast, LA, Texas, South America, and therapeutic orientation, kind of what kind of therapeutic orientations you employ in your practice. So we'll start with the first junction. You have a suicidal client, and the junction that you are standing at is, do you hospitalize the client or not? We know from research that hospitalizing in California, we call it 5150. Each state has its own code of hospitalizing people against their will, if they are a danger to self or others. But also the research have shown that hospitalization for 3-4 days increase the rate of suicidality during the hospitalization and after. So you have a junction that you are either hospitalize a patient and goes 3-4 days in the hospital, and you increase the rate of suicidality for the risk for suicidality for this patient, or you are start working more intensely on outpatient basis with the client. You give them an 988 number if they can use a texting kind of hotline as well for suicidality. A suicide contract is kind of useless. So you are in a junction that if they kill themselves in the hospital, they cannot sue you because you followed the law. But if they kill themselves if you didn't hospitalize them, they can sue you. So are you taking care of them, or are you taking care of yourself? So this is kind of a very, very interesting junction for you to pay attention to. So kind of who are you taking care of? This is junction number one. Junction number two is, are you going to lie or not to lie to a client? That's kind of interesting. Many therapists, especially older therapists or more experienced therapists, are engaged regularly in a strategic lying to a client for clinically appropriate and effective therapy. So 80% of therapists kind of reported lying to clients, which is kind of interesting statistics. So what do therapists lie about? The client asks, are you disappointed in me? Many therapists will say no, even though there is some sense of disappointment. Do you like me? When a client asks us, do you know what my problem is? And we'll say yes to reassure the client, even though it may be a lie. Can you help me? Do you believe in God? Do you think I'm an alcoholic? So this is kind of some of the typical research kind of data that was about what kind of question therapists, especially older one, more experienced one, are often or sometimes lie about. APA code is the only code that I'm aware is talk about deception or lying, and it goes like that. In situation in which deception may be ethically justifiable to maximize benefit and minimize harm, psychologists have serious obligation to consider the need for or possibility of consequences of their responsibility to correct any resulting mistrust or other harmful effect that arise from such use techniques. We're talking here about lying. So APA kind of give you an ethical justification to do that and ask you to be cautious. A third junction. Would I give my client the correct DSM diagnosis, or I give the false diagnosis that serves me as a therapist or serves my client? This is kind of the third junction. Again, it's a moral, ethical junctions that we are talking about, that people don't teach us really using these terms or this language. So, for example, many therapists will give the diagnosis that is covered by insurance, and so they can get reimbursement. And so sometimes we'll give the lighter diagnosis of adjustment disorder, not to pathologize the client in regard to work, relationship, etc. So you don't want to affect the client's employment negatively. Sometimes you want to support the client workers' comps or disability claim, and you give them a more stronger or more potent diagnosis so they can get their workers' comp or disability claims. If the client has a lawsuit that mental health is part of the lawsuit, you may give a PTSD diagnosis to support the client lawsuit. Or sometimes if the client needs accommodation, you may give a diagnosis that will support the client getting accommodation. So this is kind of an interesting junction. We need to remember that giving inaccurate or wrong diagnosis, there's two aspects of that. It's unethical practice, and it's also, if the insurance audit you and found that you gave the wrong insurance, they may ask for payback of the payment they gave you. So it's kind of part of the junctions that you need to think about. The fourth junction is something that I've been lecturing for the last 30 years, is clinical efficacy versus risk management. And I have a couple of YouTubes. I have many book chapters on the issue of touch and gifts and leaving the office and making home office and self-disclosure, all these boundaries that I have written and talked a lot. So are you clinically effective, or you kind of don't leave the office for a walk and talk therapy, or don't touch the client because risk management people told you not to touch client, or don't give gifts, or don't accept gifts. So I won't get in too much into this number 4 junction, but it's a huge junction, and there are, as I say, other recording that on YouTube recording on this very topic. Number 5. This is an interesting junction where you are you going to help the client, or are you going to obey state law? The most classic one is on that, after the Supreme Court changed its tune about abortion. If you are in Florida or in Texas and a client would like to have an abortion, and it's illegal in this state, would you give this client the address of a pharmacy in California where they can get the 2 pills within the first 10 days of pregnancy, 10 weeks of pregnancy, sorry, and have an abortion? So the junction is really interesting. Is it kind of, are you playing by the legality of the state? And if you believe in abortion and the client wants an abortion, would you give them the address of this pharmacy or an address of a clinic in California, Oregon, or any other states that where abortions are still legal? So this is kind of a very interesting junction that you need to consider and to stand in the junction consciously and observing the option, get consultation, etc. Very similar to that junction is the legality versus help to client is psychedelic. Psychedelic become very, very popular, and the efficacy is really established in many ways. So you have a junction. Do you send a client to somebody who is doing psychedelic, which is still illegal in most states, or you play by state law and don't do that? So this is an interesting junction that therapists facing right now in increased ways across the country, across the world. But in this country, psychedelics are not legal yet. The sixth junction is about coaching. Do you want to drop your work as a license in order to be a coach, or do you want to be a coach as well as licensed mental health professional? It's kind of complex. Coaching is not regulated. There is no standard of care for coaching. Any high school dropout can be a coach. What my advice, if you choose to do coaching in addition to license, separate them clearly on your website, separate in the forms that you give clients. And if you do the coaching, my strong advice, don't use DSM terms like PTSD or any kind of disorder. And in the informed consent for coaching, have this 3 statement. Coaching is not psychotherapy or mental health counseling. It does not treat mental disorders. If I suspect mental disorder, I'll refer you to a licensed mental health professional. So this is an interesting junction. If you want to be a coach, do you add it to your practice license, to your license, or you act only as a coach? If you act both, regardless, follow this advice on the coaching part. This is number 6, junction number 6. Number 7, it's an interesting kind of modern, now when people working online, it used to be on the phone, but now a lot of people do therapy via Zoom or something like that, where in modern life, so many people are mobile and go from state to state or working remotely. And but in general, what you need to remember that you should be licensed in a state where your patient is physically at, and ideally also where you are physically located or where services are provided. So there is, where is the client and where are you? Most important from a licensure point of view is so that you have a license where the client is at. So as our clients are on the move, we are standing in this junction. How do you create continuity of care where our clients go to college, our clients are moving, working in a different state, even though they may be still working kind of where state you are in. It's very complex. So just stand consciously in this junction so you can make decisions that you are informed and documented well, and you are protected the best way. And then come kind of the ultimate question that I've been asking for a long time. Is it ever ethical for a therapist to be naked with a client or even to shoot a client? Whoa. So I can tell you when I moved to the small town in Northern California, and it was very interesting because I walked out of, it's a small town with one gym. I walked out of the shower and guess who was there? A client. He was naked and I was naked in the gym, in the shower in the gym. So also when I went to teach in Esselen, and at night you go to the pool, and nobody is dressed in the pool, and I also encounter a client there that I didn't know were in Esselen at the time. So context is also a, incredible important to question that who would have asked, is it ever ethical for a therapist to be naked with a client? This is kind of crazy question, but I have encountered it in two places. So it's context, context, and context. Now, the other question about context and ethics is it ever ethical to shoot a patient dead? And we had a case in Pennsylvania in 2014 when a psychiatrist shot a violent, threatening patient that came with a gun to the psychiatrist office. So he shot him dead. So again, what's the context that even we therapists may need to shoot a client or to be naked with a client? This is called almost the ultimate questions about context. So yeah, it happened to me twice in my career that I was naked with a client, and not necessarily by choice, but there's a context where I work or taught or lived. So going back a little bit to what's involved in context. So is therapy online or in person? If we talk about online, where is the client? In what state is the client? Sometimes we don't know. Small town versus large cities. Usually being naked with a client in a gym will not happen very likely not to happen in a large city. And you also have choices of gyms. When you work in the environment of civil, police, school, military, business, so kind of all this there's a different context. You work with different individuals, family groups that create different kind of boundaries and different kind of junctions. Therapeutic orientation is part of the context. The client race, age, gender, religious, political, sexual orientation is part of the context. The setting, as I mentioned a few times before, and are you part of the community with your client in AA or NAMI or in a church? So kind of all this belong under context. The ninth junction that I want to talk about is the end of life. It's a very complex one. Some states like Hawaii, for example, may require mental health practitioner to evaluate, to determine the mental capacity of a person who wants to have an end of life decision. So sometimes we therapists are in a junction. Are we going to support a client who want to have an end of life act, or we don't? So that's kind of a very interesting junction. Even more complex junction we have in Belgium, Canada, and Oregon, for example, where a person who is mentally ill but physically healthy seek to end their life. It's a very, very interesting, there's kind of movie about it as well, or documentary about a woman in Belgium who is 24 and cut herself and tried all kind of hospitalization and medication, and at the end she wanted to die, even though physically she's actually healthy, and but mentally she is suffering and she wants to die, and she did die in Belgium. This is also allowed in Canada and in Oregon. So this is incredible junction. Are we as mental health practitioner will support this young woman death just because of the suffering at age 24? This is very, very powerful junction of life and death, end of life junction. tied to the issue of death is all our relationship to death. I can talk about it for 5 hours. And I know when I kind of traveled and lived for a while in the Somali desert, 5 out of 7 kids will die before age 2. And because the desert cannot support 7 kids. My mother taught us about life and death when we wrote on her grave, "Trees die erect." She kind of taught us. So we talked about palliative psychiatry a minute ago for people who with severe, persistent or mental health. So it's a big question, big discussion, big topic about in Alaska, you walk on the ice when the time to die, so the bear will eat you, so the young one will be able to hunt the bear and survive. And we live in a culture where we are eating the bears, the older people. So it's a big topic, but I just want to talk about incredible complex junction. So the 10th junction I want to talk about is when psychologists, we assess whether a person can get a life-saving organ. And for that, we need to make really rather subjective assessment. Can this client will not be consuming alcohol anymore? I mean, how can we do this prediction? But if we decide that the person is likely to drink again, and we recommend that we tell the people that he is likely to drink again, he won't get the organ transplant and will die. So there's some cases where we need to decide, do the client who want the transplant have significant post-surgery support, which they need to. And I know some therapists who decided that this client does not have, he's isolated, he doesn't have any support, he doesn't have any family to support him, and they advise again giving this person life-saving organ transplant. And this is like a death sentence in some regard. This is like a very, very powerful junction that mental health professionals standing do you about alcohol and around support about people who seek organ transplant. Very, very touchy and very complex. So then come almost the ultimate moral junction. Number 11, we have total 13. When a clinician can consciously and significantly increase the chance of the client death. There is an interesting movie, it's called Band of Brothers, where a soldier was hysterically blind in the last battle and in World War II. And he come to the medic in the unit, and the medic somehow empathetically talked to him, and the client hysterical blindness disappear, and suddenly he can see. And the medic tell him, go back to your unit. Go back to your unit means that he will go to the next battle with 50-60% chance of dying. So incredible, interesting junction in military where we fix the hysterical blindness, but we also have 50% plus chance of this person dying because he can go back to the unit and go to the next battle. This is a movie, Band of Brothers, but it's also, it happened in real life. When I was working in a prison, I had hard choices about putting people on suicide watch. And sometimes I have like 25 seconds to report hold to decide whether I put somebody on a suicide watch or not. My concern is that putting a prisoner on suicide watch, they'll be waking up every 15-25 minutes, and they'll be suicidal just for lack of sleep. So this was a very, very complex junction for me when I had to make this decision about whether to put prisoners in jail or prison on suicide watch. It was really, really hard for me. So then law enforcement also have often kind of judgment about clearing officers to work, and which can risk the law enforcement officer's life. The number 12 out of 13 is the issue of the death penalty. The death penalty is very complex and morally in many other ways. There are two criteria that usually people, if they have an IQ, the people can qualify, so to speak, to the death penalty. So if the person have an IQ above 70, and also if the disability did not manifest before adulthood. So psychologists, mental health workers, social worker need to choose what IQ test to give to this person, whether they are European, they are Hispanic, they are African American, and we know that different tests, we are likely to give different IQ score. And if we give a test that is likely to give this person with this style, with this kind of personality, with this kind of ethnicity above 70, they may be executed. So here we are in incredible junction, or arbitrary to decide, how do we know whether patient disability manifest or didn't manifest before adulthood? So we are in incredible, powerful position, junction, what IQ test to give to this person from this culture in this kind of background, or is a disability to decide arbitrarily in some regard, is a disability manifest before adulthood or not? How would we know really in a scientific way? And our decision can be life and death decision. That is like incredible junction. And there's some case in Texas where somebody really gave tests that the person score above IQ, and 3 prisoners were executed because of that. He lost his license, but it's still the question about who qualify for the death penalty is a huge, huge junction. And the last one is very complex, and I can spend 2 hours on that. It's about mandatory reporting. Do we have mandatory reporting for a 10-year-old child who were playing with a boy, playing with a girl, and we decide that we have a sex offender here? And if we do that to this child at age 10, 12, it will follow them for the rest of their life. And it's kind of big movement to become much more conscious about mandatory reporting. There's an illusion that we must report everything, and the question is much more complex and much more nuanced. But we need to understand what's the risk and or of the statement, when in doubt, report child abuse. So it's mandatory reporting laws led to more than 3 million annual child abuse reports in the U.S. That's a lot, and this can goes to life, where how you work and where you live and what kind of family you can create. So I'm requesting here, stand in a junction in a more conscious way rather than automatically fly into mandatory reporting. Understand the consequences. Understand that it's not 100% clear where you need to report or not. It's not as rigid and as clear as we think, that the laws are actually much more vague and give clinician a wide range of choices whether we're going to report and in fact destroy this person's life forever, even though they're only 12-year-old, or not. So this is a very, very important junction to know that it's not an automatic reporting. Get consultation with an attorney, get consultation with risk management, get consultation with experienced clinicians in the topic, but don't just jump that mandatory reporting, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's not true. So to recap, the 13 moral junctions that kind of invited you to think of. Identify yourself. What is a junction in your practice? Ethical, clinical, legal, moral junction. Be aware about the risk management concern. Be aware of the consequences of your action. Be aware, are you protecting yourself as a risk management or are you protecting the client? And there's a place for risk management, but not necessarily to always protect ourselves and to avoid the risk at the expense of the clients. After all, we got licensed and we are treating people for that. So think about the moral junctions that you are facing. Identify and reflect your own moral ethical stance and junctions, and dare to pause in the junction and to think about the ethics and the morality that I have discussed today with you. Consult, consult, and consult. And good luck.